Welcome to Cokesbury College. This is the oldest Methodist college in the world, and it was birthed in 1785 and burned to the ground in 1795. We'll be taking a little bit of a tour today so that you can see what this school would have looked like even in the landscape as we know it now. There's an active congregation meeting in the chapel just off camera to my right. And so as we gather here together today, I'm Reverend Bonnie McCubbin. I serve as the Director of Museums and Pilgrimage for the Baltimore-Washington Conference of the United Methodist Church. And as we're gathered here together today, you can see in front of you a model of what the college might have looked like. The college was a brainchild, actually, of Francis Asbury and Thomas Coke and others. And they wanted to have a place where the sons of itinerant preachers, locals, and orphans could get a high-quality education. And they wanted to model it after the John Wesley's Kingswood School in Bristol, England, which predated it by a couple of decades. And so at the Christmas conference of 1784, as the preachers were gathered together to establish the Methodist Episcopal Church, they came up with the proposal to begin a college for these students, for these males, which was to become the first college in this area and the only institution of higher education into the middle of the 20th century. And they took up an offering and raised over $5,000 at that time for the building and education of the students. And it took about 2 years for the building to be built, but they did take in students immediately, and they began educating them here on this site. By December the 6th of 1787, the first 25 regular students joined in with the preparatory students who had already been educated here for 2 years. It was a 3-story building made out of brick with a slate roof. We're standing at where the entrance to the building might have been. And they would have entered through the door. While we don't have exact records of how everything was laid out, what we do know is that there was a president's room probably on the opposite end that was designed for the president of the school to have their office. We also know that there was a library, and I imagine that would have been on the first floor on this end of the building. And it housed Francis Asbury's personal library. It was valued at over $50,000 in that time, which is worth over $2 million with inflation today. On the other floors, there would have been classrooms on the second floor and dormitory rooms on the third floor. But there weren't many places for the students to sleep. The idea was that students would be able to be housed with the locals in town. The curriculum here was very strict. There are 18 rules that the students had to follow, one of which was to be no play. They believed that they had to work and work hard, and any recreation would be things like woodworking, gardening, taking a walk, or similar things along those veins. They also were allowed recreation of bathing when they chose, but they were only allowed to bathe for up to 1 minute at a time under the supervision of a teacher. They are located here in this area because it was on the main post road between Baltimore and Philadelphia, the two economic centers of the time. This was also a common location where the preachers would retreat after meeting at annual or later general conference in Baltimore. And so we are about 35 miles northeast of Baltimore City. And during the summers, there would be a yellow fever epidemic, and so the preachers would retreat out here to escape the foul air of Baltimore City. And they would be here to interact with the students. Sometimes they would even pay them a fee for knowing their lessons and for knowing what they had been taught. And so the students were here for a while, but the school could never turn a profit. They had too many charity students and not enough paying students. By the 1790s, they had over $6,000 in debt. There were preachers who didn't agree with what they were doing, like James O'Kelly. Reverend O'Kelly was a Methodist dissident who started out in the preachers' conferences, but he thought that we should not be educating people when we could be using those funds to save souls. And so he made himself very vocal and verbal and made it known that he did not want this school to exist any longer. The school would have been 108 feet long and 40 feet deep. And so it wasn't a very big location, but it had an outsized proportional relationship to what was happening in the area at the time. You saw earlier the main road that comes in from the where the train station would have been as you go all along, and it leads straight up to the chapel at the church. This was the original church that was here when the students were here, located just 40 feet away. It was December 7th of 1795 when the headmaster here was in town visiting friends, and there arose a cry that the school was burning. And so they came rushing back, and despite all of the firefighters' best efforts, they could not save the building, and it was deemed a total loss. The governor of Maryland at the time offered a $1,000 reward, believing that it was arson that burned this institution, and they offered a $1,000 reward to catch the arsonist. Today, however, as we see what's here, the local church gained control of the property that the school was on that had been part of what was then the Baltimore Conference. They gained control of it in the 1840s, and so the cemetery behind me is what was put in that property afterward. But you can see the outline of the building still in the grass today. There are markers at each of the four corners that you can come out and stand by to see where this building would have been located. Another legacy of this school was that it had a bell here, the Cokesbury bell, and it rang in students every day to class. And this bell was found in the ruins by Dr. John Goucher, and it was then carted off to what was then the Women's College of Baltimore, where it rang in the girls there until the school moved out to Baltimore County, and the bell became into the collection of Lovely Lane Museum and Archives. Let's take a moment and hear what this bell might have sounded like on one of those cold and blistery days. The clear, crisp bell was one of the many ways that the people would know what was here at that time. The building was burned in 1795, but we know from the archaeological record that there were walls still standing close to the church up until the 1840s. During the picnic movement, people would actually come out on special trains from Baltimore to come on a pilgrimage to this very site to remember the educational legacy that was begun here, to share in a meal in this space, on this hallowed ground, and to remember the students that had served here and the pastors who had served here as well. These pilgrimages continued for over 100 years, and we are continuing in that tradition today by welcoming you on this pilgrimage. Today, the legacy of this college, while it was very short in its existence, we know that it has launched a legacy of 13 United Methodist seminaries and over 122 United Methodist-related institutions of higher education and learning. And so we invite you to come on out here to join the folks at Cokesbury Memorial and to see what has happened in this hallowed ground.